Hello everyone, my name is Heather Davis from RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, and like my colleagues I'll be talking about leadership and complexity, and my particular interest is in the university sector like Julie. For me, it's not that complexity is just a 21st century issue. Complexity has actually always been with us, but it hasn't always been discussable in a world that is very attached to order and certainty. In what has been described as a century of complexity then, what might complexity look like? And how do we know when we're bumping up against it? Here are some examples of what I'm talking about with complexity and how that might differ from the simple and the complicated. So for example, a simple task would be to bake a cake. There's a recipe, we understand that if we follow that recipe, all will be well. If we want to send a rocket to the moon, this is more of a complicated task. Again, we have a set of rules to follow, but there's lots of mechanical things going on, so it's a lot more complicated than baking a cake. And raising a child is definitely a complex task. Like all complex tasks, every child and every situation is unique. Previous success is no guarantee of future success, and while expertise might help, it isn't necessary or sufficient. The enduring metaphor of the industrial era was the machine, whereas ecologies are emerging as the knowledge era metaphor, and Cynthia Cherry mentioned this in her keynote. The speed of changes experienced in the last 50 years has added to the complexity that naturally occurs at the intersection of changing paradigms. Our current and emerging worlds are very different to the industrial era, but we're still very, very much of our current economic management and leadership thinking is drawn. Our worlds are actually turbulent and always have been, so it makes sense to think about harnessing the strength of these conditions rather than spending our energy trying to tame them or order them. For me, this was one of those seminal quotes that really helped me understand, these sorts of changes. So just as the Iron Age didn't end because we ran out of iron, the industrial era isn't ending because we're running out of industry. Rather, the knowledge era is emerging because industrial era mindsets are outmoded. Industrial era thinking does not provide the language to tackle the complexities of our leadership responsibilities for the one planet and many worlds we're a part of. And the term relanguaging has been used over and over again at this ILA conference, and that's an example of why we've shifted from the industrial era to the knowledge era. We need another way of having a language so we can kind of formulate the problems and see those problems. The VUCA acronym, Volatility, Uncertainty, Complexity and Ambiguity, that Julie also is using in her work, really do define the conditions that mark the 21st century. And almost by the temerity of calling them an acronym, we've got a way of working with them. Like instead of pretending they're not happening or feeling powerless in the face of them, someone's turned them into an acronym. Hello, we can actually work with that. And that's actually come from the military, but I think Bob Johansen is actually not only showing us that this acronym is a representation of what was happening, but this is the way he's working with it. And in particular, what we're talking about today is trying to use complexity to help clarify some of these issues. There is an inherent uncertainty and ambiguity in the contestations of human acts of knowing. These naturally lend themselves to complexity-based thinking. Where then do the intersections of leadership and complexity occur in organisations? Drawing on Snowden and Stanbridge's landscapes of management model, and the estate, even David Snowden uses a 2x2 matrix, our work generally fits within one of four domains. Depending on the situation, we can locate our work depending on the tolerance for certainty from order to what they call unorder, but I've changed that to VUCA, so along this axis, and also our tolerance for ambiguity on how we actually process that. Do we use rules or processes? And so out of that we have 4 domains, and for me the area of social complexity is where I'm wanting us to head, but I think this is a really good model to show the similarities and differences between those other areas. So down here we've got the management area really, and as Mintzberg said, that's where management consultants in the 20th century made their dough, basically. This is the work of total quality management, all of those. Diametrically up here is social complexity, so there's actually not a lot in common there. But social complexity and mathematical complexity have a compatibility around their tolerance for the VUCA environment, and social complexity and systems thinking have an affinity around their high tolerance for ambiguity and the way that they use processes. Social complexity theories then recognise that human systems are different from those which otherwise occur in nature, and that humans are not machines. Therefore, complexity theories that seek to address social complexity, I believe, are a good fit for leadership scholarship. Today's social complexity draws on particular kinds of complexity theories, which can be traced back all the way to the ancient Greek Heraclitus, who reasoned that the fundamental stuff of the world was volatile flux, process, passage and change. Complexity in these terms is viewed as the unpredictable outcome of a myriad of time-dependent relational processes. Making these human systems visible acknowledges active engagement with leadership. Goldstein suggests that insight into complex systems is possible through actively modelling them, making interventions on them, and leading these human systems. Social complexity theories, therefore, afford the space to view human systems and leadership as relational, as the ability to shape perceptions of the world to create our new realities together. Maguire and McKelvey contend that human organisations epitomise complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems theory itself emerged from the Santa Fe Institute in the 1980s. Examples of it can be found in the natural world as well as within human, cultural and social systems. Once we learn to recognise patterns of complex adaptive systems, we begin to see them everywhere. They all share certain properties, but chief amongst them is that each of these systems is a network of many agents acting in parallel, and each agent finds itself in an environment produced by its interactions with other agents in the system. And as another example of social complexity is Robert Cheer's dynamic complexity theory, that identifies our living reality as one that is perpetually becoming, renewing itself and perishing. My research is concerned with identifying appropriate leadership literacies for the knowledge era, and then testing these to see if they are currently being practiced and theorised in universities in Australia. I use the term literacies here to signify that these leadership understandings are embodied, not just learnt by rote. And using my study as context, for me this is how social complexity made visible might look in action. I have investigated 4 separate yet interrelated domains of knowledge production, itself a complex task, to identify these leadership literacies. As a practice-led researcher, a sense of disquiet about the power relations in my own workplace actually led me to my study. The second is on mindsets, and this gave me the necessary insight about the paradigmatic conditions that produce thinking patterns appropriate for their time. The third emerged from the active engagement of doing this work as a way to make sense of what I was discovering and also the conditions that we are experiencing in the 21st century. So drawing on these contexts led me to look for a particular kind of leadership, and it's not the command and control kind of leadership. So it's led me to particular kinds of leadership literature based on humanistic and relational concerns, which have quite a long history actually. And also with leadership literature seeking to expand the notion of leadership to mean much more than just the leader. That is, tracking the emergence of the concept of leadership as work. Synthesised, the work of knowledge era leadership can be articulated like this. Much more of this, and much less of this. And using Joyce Fletcher's post-heroic leadership model, in concert with Manfred Pettigree's notion of leaders are in the business of energy management, which underpins everything that I've been looking at, this is what I believe leadership literacies for the knowledge era may be conceptualised as. This conceptualisation really could not have been conceived without an understanding that complex social processes actually underpin everything we do in terms of leadership practice. And I'll just let you muse on those for a moment and perhaps play ILA bingo and see how many of these notions that you've come across in the last couple of days. Because what I've come to understand from the ILA, my work is really bringing together the work of others that maybe has been kept silent a bit long. I don't have a new model to show the world. It's my job to bring these together and to magnify these, and hopefully we can join together from that attractor stage of complex adaptive systems and actually move this agenda forward. What I really liked about this model, the post-heroic leadership model, is that learning actually sits within the model, not outside it. And one of the key findings from my research is the notion of learning metabolism. You know, we need to be learning, things are happening very quickly, we need to be adapting, and we need to be putting that back into our workplaces as well. So the idea of learning metabolism really does help with that notion. So one particular example of complexity leadership theory is one that we actually all came to the table with. So that was kind of the attractor that brought us all together. When we Skyped for the first time, we all had a hard copy of this particular theory, which was a really powerful moment in itself. So complexity leadership theory has been developed by Mary Yulbeen and her colleagues. It not only provides a framework to enable the necessary learning, innovative and adaptive capacity of complex adaptive systems that they expect, but really importantly for this time in history, it also recognises that this work is still undertaken within larger bureaucratic structures. So it's not throwing everything out, it understands that we need to be working with this dynamic model. So the dynamic model is about the interplay and entanglement between formal bureaucratic administrative functions and informal and adaptive functions. This interplay is enacted through enabling leadership, which is the often invisible relational work that has always been important, if perhaps not privileged. Enabling leadership fosters optimal conditions of entanglement between adaptive leadership and the necessary administrative and governance requirements of the organisation. And in the last session, Richard Carroll talked about joined-up leadership, and straight away I thought that's another term, or we're starting to talk about this sort of language so we can work with all of the different dynamics. And I really like that term. So again, complexity leadership theory allows for a lot more of this. And it allows for that leadership as work to actually take place. So it allows for a lot more of this, and it allows for just the minimum of this, and perhaps a little bit of a different this part of the administrative stuff. We're not to be driven by this. This is in the service of the adaptive processes of the organisation. So in conclusion, some of the difficulties we face today lie not only in the VUCA worlds we live in, but also in the way we're being conditioned to see the world. Yet there always have been other ways of seeing and knowing our worlds, not just the ones that are privileged by the dominant view. Social complexity theories and VUCA are examples of working with the volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity of our times. They open up spaces to encourage dialogue and to challenge the status quo. In particular, complex adaptive systems theory lets us see that there are always many agents acting in parallel. And once we come to understand our interrelatedness with the world, we cannot unsee these patterns. We cannot actually go back. And once these patterns are recognised, we begin to see them everywhere. Not the least here at the ILA conference, concerned with remapping the purposes of leadership for our one planet and many worlds. Thank you.